Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and friends of the Millicent Library. I'm so excited to see you here. I'm Wendy Drum, I'm the president of the Millicent Friends. We are the sponsors of tonight's event. The purpose of the Friends, and I'll be brief, is to engage the community to partake in many services that are provided by the library. The library can really enrich our minds and our creativity. And what we want to do is we want to create support, learning opportunities for people of all ages. We want to enhance the Friends' plans with active volunteers and proactive fundraising to make these events possible. Recently, the Friends, thanks to your donations and to your memberships, bought 5 new computers for the library, top of the line. And we're also funding, as for the library, a new venture called Millicent's Tech Lab. And that's an area where these computers are and other technologies. We want to be right in step with technology that other libraries have too, and fill in gaps that you may not have at home. Among other projects the Friends are funding, we're helping to renovate the library's auditorium. And the idea is we're renovating it for Fairhaven's children. So Allie will have, who's a librarian for children, will have an opportunity to make a very happy and creative experience by transforming the auditorium. So excited about that. Lastly, at the end of our fiscal year, we decide and we approve our named board members and officers going forward. So I will very quickly, our officers are president, that's me, Wendy Drum. Vice president is Barbara Mitchell. Treasurer is Wendy Drum. And the secretary, recording secretary, is Beth Louie. Board of directors, Beth Louie, Ken Lipman. We have a wonderful board, by the way. Myself, Barbara Mitchell, Jeff Lucas, Ann Mazzone, and Cheryl Day. Wonderful board. So what I now need to do is I have to get approval from a representative of the board of directors to our slate for the upcoming year. I would like to recognize Barbara Mitchell, who's the vice president, for her approval. Barbara?
Yes.
Oh, okay.
So I cast one vote as a slate of officers for the Friends of the Millicent Library Board.
Thank you. Accepted. Thank you. And now, to begin the program, I would like to introduce you to Ann Mazzone, who is going to introduce our author. Ann is such a fan. I mean, we're talking Beatles fan here. So what I want you to do is, I want you to buckle up your seatbelts, because we're going on a real ride. Thank you.
It's wonderful to see so many friends of the library, members of the Coast Guard Auxiliary, local town people, friends from other towns, and even a couple of members I saw from my sailing club. Welcome, and thank you for coming. Tonight, the Friends of the Millicent Library are very pleased to present a special guest. He is a Massachusetts resident and the author of over 30 books, one of which was made into a Disney film. He will tell you of that harrowing rescue tonight. Michael is a master at researching every detail and has an amazing skill for retelling these sea stories, which will have you reading into the early years. Please welcome Michael Tougias as he tells the fantastic true story of the Pendleton rescue by 4 Coast Guardmen of the Chatham Light Station during the blizzard of February 1952. Michael.
Nice turnout. It's fantastic. I thought I'd take a couple minutes to tell you a little bit about myself, what I've been working on, and I do a newsletter every year, so before I get started, if you're interested, it comes out each October, so you could, if you're interested, you could put your email for this half of the room, and for this half of the room. You wanted a close-up? So, this, the story that I'll be showing you, we got really lucky with the Disney movie, and I thought they did a nice job. I'd say, you know, at least 80% of the movie is true and accurate. And usually when Hollywood gets a story, you know, they change the whole thing. So we were very lucky. And I'm probably best known for, you know, these type of books. I'm just going to, you know, these survival at sea type of books. I've done 7 like this about rescues and survival at sea. But the last 3 years I've branched out. And during COVID, I did a book that's unusual for me. It's called No Will Set You Free. And it's about people who have difficulty saying no. I used to be one of those people, but then if you want to be a writer and you're holding down a day job, which I was many years ago, you've got to say no to all these requests on your time. So I wrote this during COVID. But then I started working with a editor at Macmillan, and now she's at Little Brown, and we started to take the adult books and turn them into young adult books. So, for example, The Finest Hours, there's 3 versions of it. This is the adult version cover, and this is the middle reader version cover, a little different. And then there's one for even younger readers, maybe age, you know, like 6 to 8. The middle readers would be 9 to 15. And I've got them set up on different tables. That over there are the young adult readers, and in the back is the adult sea rescue books. So the latest effort that I did in turning an adult book to a young adult book, thank you very much, is called In Harm's Way. And this was unusual for me because I did not write the adult version. Doug Stanton did, and this is about the sinking of the Indianapolis in World War II. That's the one where the men were in the water for 5 days, and the sharks got most of them. So when he approached me to do the young adult version, first I said no, and both him and Macmillan publishers. I said, because I'm going to really cut your 500-page book down to half that size and, you know, rewrite parts. But he said, no, I've seen yours others, go ahead and do it, I won't be looking over your shoulder. And he was good to his word. So this came out 5 months ago. So it's called In Harm's Way, and this is like a hybrid for both young adults and for adults who want a much quicker read of the book. You know, for example, in his adult version, the ship doesn't sink until page 112, and my book it sinks on page 10. So I move it along. And just so you know that I'm not always writing about, I've written books on war, like 2 on King Philip's War, 1 with Eric Schultz. And, but every now and then I like to have fun, so this just came out. This is for young adults. And it's called Claws, and it's a takeoff on Jaws. Only instead of this giant shark, it's this giant lobster. And a 12-year-old girl knows about this giant lobster, and nobody believes her. And the reason I did it was I'm friends with a lot of commercial lobster fishermen. And one of them showed me just the claw, not the arm, just the claw of a lobster that was 20 inches across. I said, how big was the lobster? And he said, well, only the claw could fit in the trap. So when we pulled it up, all we got was the claw with, you know, whatever, 20 pounds of meat. And that got me thinking, could there be a giant lobster out there? And then for adults, a less serious book. This is about my cabin in Vermont. I bought it when I was 22 years old. Thought I'd live up there like a mountain man. Failed miserably. Kind of like Bill Bryce's A Walk in the Woods. It's called there's a porcupine in my outhouse. The Vermont Misadventures of a Mountain Man Wannabe. So moving on to tonight's presentation, what I thought I'd do is take you on this journey using slides, and maybe in one or two spots, a very short reading from the book. But if you've seen the movie, they focus on the Pendleton rescue, and I'm going to focus on both the Fort Mercer and the Pendleton, because two ships split in half on the same day, maybe about 30 miles apart. So the Coast Guard was overwhelmed in this winter storm. So pretend you're watching a movie, only this one's the documentary, Disney's the fictionalized, non-fiction version. So here's where the two ships were. It's kind of odd, the part of the slide is cut out. Let's see if I can fix that. We'll see if it happens on the next slide. But the one closer to land, that's the Pendleton, and the one out to sea is the Fort Mercer. And the dotted lines show where they drifted to, and then X marks the spot of the rescue. Trying to get this out of here. All right. So we'll see if the next slide cuts it off or not. So let's move ahead. So far, so good, I think. I think there's more on the computer. That first slide was still there, so I think we're good. So this is the Fort Mercer, but only half of it, the bow section. So in this winter storm, the waves were so big, they broke in half these two oil tankers. So as you can see, there's a catwalk going from the bridge up to the point of the bow, and you did have casualties. One man right off the bat tried to get up to that high point of the ship and was swept away. So even though this is known as the Coast Guard's greatest rescue, there were casualties. First thing the Coast Guard did was send out these 5 young men from Nantucket. That was a big mistake because they were in a small boat. The waves were 40, sometimes 50 feet, and they never did get to the Fort Mercer. They got lucky and found their way to the Pollock lightship. And so the men on board the lightship is like a floating lighthouse that the Coast Guard keeps manned. You know, so you drop anchor at a dangerous spot, light it up like a Christmas tree, and that would warn the mariners. And so they were able to get on board, but they did suffer one accident. The people on board threw down a line, and there's a weight on the end, they call it a monkey fist, and it hit one of the guys right in the eye. So if I go back, you see that man in the upper part, he's got a shiner, but that's a small price to pay for having your life saved. So then a Coast Guard cutter arrived, and that was called the Yakutat. And so they see that this half a ship is sinking, so they send over life raft. And that's one part of the book I want to read to you from, because it's interesting what happened. The second half of the presentation, we moved to the Pendleton, where Richard Lipsey, who lived here in Fairhaven, I'll introduce you to him. So, on the Mercer's bow, the survivors watched the rafts come towards them. It was decision time, and what an awful decision it was. Each man had to make a choice in the next minute that might mean the difference between life and death. There was no one to give them guidance, assurance, or even the odds they faced, because no one knew what would happen next. If they stayed on the fractured ship, they risked the chance that she might roll over at any moment, taking them down with her, trapping them in the freezing black water below. But to jump from the ship held its own perils, not the least of which was the possibility they would not land inside the raft. And if they happened to simply didn't know what the ocean would do to them, maybe they would have the strength to swim to the raft and haul themselves up and in, or maybe the frigid seas would so weaken them that they would never even make it to the side of the raft, let alone climb on board. One more paragraph I'll read. 3 crew members on board felt the rafts were their best chance of escaping the storm alive. They crawled to the side of the deck and one by one threw themselves overboard and down toward the rafts. All 3 missed the rafts. The shock of freezing water made swimming nearly impossible, and although they tried to get to the rafts, the mountainous seas buried them and they disappeared from view. Captain Nab on the Yakutat watched in horror as the seas swallowed the men. So they had another 3 fatalities right off the bat. They never even got into the life rafts. And I later learned, after the book was published, there was someone in an audience when I was giving the talk, and they said, "That's my father standing up on the ship." And she explained the reason the men couldn't get in the rafts is a gust of wind blew it 25 yards away. And there's no way with their heavy clothing they could swim that far in the middle of winter. So then on the Yakutat, they lowered their small launch because the rafts weren't working and tried to get the men this way. And the joy of doing the book was finding these men who were there at the time. Most of them sadly passed away, but I did find Gil Carmichael, who's on this photo at the back of the launch. And he said, even though it's day 2 of the rescue now, so we're in day 2, he said, and the seas have gone down a little bit, and he said, I was still terrified, but he said, we made it over there. We motioned for men to jump. He said 2 jumped. They landed in the water. We pulled them into the little boat, and then a wave slammed us into the big sinking oil tanker and fractured the wooden ribs on our little rescue boat. And he said, so there were still 2 men on the vessel, but we had to say, don't jump, don't jump. And this slide, Gil had never seen this, so I sent it to him. I said, there you are coming back, and there's 2 survivors covered in the white blankets. And I said to him, what happened next? And he goes, I don't remember. And I said, why? And he said, they lowered the block and tackle, to lift up the little boat. And he said it was swinging in the big wind. And he said, it hit me in the head, knocked me out cold. And he said, when I came to, I was in my bunk. And he said, I thought I dreamed the whole thing. He didn't even think it was real. And he said, so, once I gathered my wits, I went up on the deck, and this is what I saw. It was real, and they'd gone back to sending the life rafts over. And it was interesting what happened next. So there's only 2 men left alive on the sinking oil tanker. And, the way they send the life rafts over, they shoot a line over, and the 2 men would pull the raft closer. They tie the line off so it doesn't blow away, and then they jumped, and they were able to get in the life raft. But they're so hypothermic, they can't manipulate their fingers to untie the knot going back to the sinking oil tanker. So if you can imagine, there's a line from the back of the raft and the front. One's going to the Coast Guard cutter and the other's going to the tanker, and now they're trapped. So I said to Bill Bleakley, another Coast Guard man who was there, what did you guys do? And he said, I happened to be next to the captain, and I said, Captain, we have no choice but to back down. In other words, put the cutter in reverse and hope that the line breaks on the side towards the tanker, and then we can pull them in. And I said, well, what happened when you put it in reverse? And he said, I couldn't watch. He said, because the lines went tight, and he said the life raft went up in the air between the 2 ships, and he said, these guys are hanging on for dear life. And then he heard a gasp, and the line snapped on the side towards the oil tanker. And he said, I looked, and then we pulled them in as fast as we could. So it's amazing, from 1952, we have these action photos of what happened. Here, you can see one of the men in the life raft. He's frozen, he can't even get out of it. So Coast Guard men tied ropes around their waist and went down and tied these survivors to themselves, and then they were pulled back up. So those two men did make it out alive. And here's the last man being taken out of the life raft. So again, this is day 2 of the Fort Mercer rescue, and then something really odd happens. Someone on board the cutter shouts, "Look, look," and he's pointing back towards the oil tanker, and everybody looks that way instead of at the raft. And look what happens. The whole tanker just rears up in the air, and I thought it would flop over. But they said no, it went down slowly like the Titanic. And so think of the odds. Those two men got off with maybe 5 minutes to spare on day 2. So talk about luck. Had they, waited a little bit, they would have gone down with the ship, but the suction would have taken them down. So throughout the book, there is elements of luck and bad luck. So oftentimes in these survival stories, it's timing. And that was the last photo taken before it disappeared and sank. Now the stern section was in a little bit better shape. As you see I think it's the next slide. Yeah, you see it's not at a real steep angle in the water, but you can see the twisted metal where it broke in half. And I was lucky enough to find a Coast Guard man who got the original SOS from the Fort Mercer. He's standing next to the man with the beard in the back, and his name was Len Whitmore. He lived in Newburyport. And Len said, I got the SOS on the headphones, but he said, I wasn't sure what we were going to do because we were on an ice cutter, not too far away, but we're not used to doing rescues. And he said, I told the captain, and of course we had to go and do the rescue, and people assume that, I had served in the Coast Guard, but I never did. So as I'm writing these books, I just sit with these Coast Guard men and women. Like there's a more recent book in the back table there called A Storm Too Soon, and another one, Overboard, where they're doing the rescue with pilots, helicopter pilots, and rescue swimmers. But in 1952, they never did rescues with helicopters, and they didn't even have rescue swimmers at the time. So I said to Lynn, how does an icebreaker break the ice? Do you ram it? And he said, no, here's our ship called the East Wind. And he said, we ride our bow up on the ice, and the weight of the cutter cracks it, and then we form this path. And I said, well, what if the ice is 4 feet thick? And I'll never forget, he goes, I'll send you a photo, and this is what he sent me. He said, we blow it up. And then we put the bow up. So you can see how much fun it was, working with these men who are in their 80s and are thinking back to their 1952 days of service in the Coast Guard. And then here is the East Wind arriving at the Fort Mercer. And I said, well, what did you do when you got there? And he said, we sent over a life raft. What else could we do? And as you see in this picture, at least if anybody jumps, it's only about 10 to 15 feet to reach the life raft. Whereas that other section of the Fort Mercer was a good 30-foot jump. And one man does jump, and he makes it into the life raft. And Lynn said, so we pulled him back, but he said, right about halfway between the two ships, a big roller came, hit the life raft. He said, I watched that man flip up in the air like a pancake and land right back in the life raft. He said he was so lucky. And he sent a picture. This is right before he jumps, and then here he is next to the ship. And then they brought him on board, and of course hypothermia, drowning is the #1 issue, but hypothermia is #2. And they, so he explained, we bundled them up, we bring them down to the galley, give them a bunch of tea or coffee or soup, anything to warm them up. And with hypothermia, the bigger you are, the longer you last, the bigger body mass, whether it's height or weight. So children do the worst in cold water, and bigger people do the best. So they asked for help, and another cutter came out. You see at the top of the screen, it's much smaller. This came down from Maine, called the Acushnet. And so I knew who the captain was, so I called every John Joseph in the country. And I did find his family, but he had passed away, so I got his son. And his son knew quite a bit about what happened. And at the end of the conversation, his son goes, my father wrote a story for Reader's Digest. They never did publish it, but he said, I have the manuscript, would you like it? And I was like, yes. And it was amazing. It was 10 typewritten pages. So it was like sitting down with a cup of coffee with Captain Joseph that you see in this picture. So that was a lucky break to, have an eyewitness to write it all down while it was fresh. And he explained that, he pulled up his smaller cutter next to the oil tanker, and he really had to coax the men to jump. And it was going good. They were jumping, but one man hit a patch of ice on the cutter and slid and almost went off the other side. So the last 13 men refused to leave the sinking ship, which you would think is not good, especially the number 13. And just a little aside about doing research, you always want to use eyewitness sources, and most of the survivors have passed away. But they were from all over the country, and each one gave an interview to their local newspaper. So, for example, the New Orleans Times-Picayune, these two survivors, shown with Captain Joseph, they gave a first-hand account of what happened on board the sinking oil tanker. So those were really helpful. This is back in the day when everything was on microfiche, so I'd run to the Boston Public Library from my day job, pretending I was going to a meeting, and I'd bring up the microfiche, hit print, and then run back to the office. And I did that every day for 3 months. So I printed every newspaper in the country over time. There's 3 survivors in borrowed clothing because, their clothing was all wet. And the 13 men that stayed on the tanker, if you look closely up above, there's one man waving. This picture is taken from a circling aircraft. And he's basically saying, we're okay, we're okay. And he was right. The ship never did sink. This section of it, remember the other one sank suddenly. But this section never did sink, and it even had power. So the owners of the ship decided we're going to tow it to Newport and salvage it, and they did. And I remember a coastie told me, he said, I was in Newport, I'd been involved in the rescue, I couldn't believe, here's the ship coming in. And he said, so I went out with the media figuring we're going to find these survivors, frozen and half dead. He said they lowered a Jacob's ladder, we went up, and he said the survivors welcomed us with a bacon and eggs breakfast. Because they had power, they were warm, they were fine. So if you were on this section of the ship, the right move was to stay with them. And what I learned doing these books is the bow usually sinks first. The stern stays up a lot longer, it has more compartments at the engine room. And over I've seen that case. So Disney, when they did the movie, they said, we can't do 2 ships breaking in half, and it's 4 pieces, we'll lose the audience, and they were right. Let's focus on just one part of the Pendleton that has a clear hero, and that involves the man from Fairhaven, who you'll meet in a minute. So he and the other rescuers were stationed here at Coast Guard Station Chatham. Here it is in the 40s or 1950s. And then it looks the same today. So Disney filmed some of the movie right here, and they brought in a big snow gun and made it look like a blizzard. And then the commanding officer, his name was Donald Clough. And by the way, in the movie, they make him out to be really cold-hearted, but in reality, what were his choices? You know, if he sent his men out into this terrible winter storm, chances are some of his own men are going to perish. But if he does nothing, everybody's going to second guess him. Why didn't you send out your men? This is what the Coast Guard does. So he decided, I've got to send my men out. And the first group was led by Donald Bangs, and he's in the light-colored hat. I was able to track down his family and get some information direct. And they went out to the bow section of the Pendleton. They were coming out of Stage Harbor, so they went around Monomoy. And it was interesting, you know, Bangs left some notes, and he said, by now it was dark. And this is the first day of the rescue, so the waves are huge. He said one man came out to the very tip of the bow with a lantern. He said he jumped, it's night, and hit the ocean with big waves. We couldn't get him. And he said nobody else came out. And yet, you know, I know from the research, there were 5 other men, including the captain, on this section of the ship, Captain Fitzgerald. What happened to them? Why didn't they, you know, come out with a lantern or make some kind of signal? And that'll always be a mystery. We won't figure that out. Here's an old map of the area. So, you know, near that Anchorage area, K, that would be roughly where the 2 sections of the Pendleton ended up. And then Coast Guard Station Chatham would be at the top of the screen. And then that long island to the bottom is Monomoy Island. You know, today that's where all the sharks are. That's covered with seals. I fish out there in a boat, and it's just wall-to-wall seals. So most of the great whites are in this back side of the cape, and that's why I don't swim there anymore. You know, so if the cape is shaped like my arm, you know, Chatham is at the elbow, and most of the sharks are in this section, from Chatham to Race Point. But back then, there were no seals. Even just 25 years ago, I barely ever saw a seal, but now the population is going nuts, so we're going to get more and more great whites. So they turned to this man, Bernie Weber. This is the hero of the movie. And I worked closely with Bernie. He read every section of the first drafts. The commanding officer turns to him and goes, Weber, you got to pick yourself a crew. You got to go out and go to the stern section. And Bernie told me, I did not want to go. He said, I thought this would be a suicide mission. And so I didn't want to pick who's going to come with me, because I'd be saying, you know, you come with me and we're not coming back. And he said I got lucky and 3 men volunteered. So in this slide, that's Bernie on the left, and then from Fairhaven is Richard Lipsey, who volunteered. They were friends, and Richard didn't want Bernie to have to, you know, pick somebody else or somebody else volunteer. He wanted to go with Bernie, and he had big faith in Bernie's skill at maneuvering this boat. And then Andy Fitzgerald volunteered, very young. Andy was only 20 years old. Richard was only 22. So these are really young. And then there's a 3rd man who volunteered. And his name was Urban Mask. He's not in this picture. So that the little rescue boat that they took out was up at the fishing pier. I'll show you a picture in a minute at the top of the screen. And they come down and they have to go over the Chatham Bar. And the Chatham Bar is basically a big sandbar, so you've got these giant waves rolling in, they're going to hit the bar, and then they're going to break. So that's where they know the trouble is. And Bertie said, I didn't even think about getting to the oil tanker and what we were going to do then. I was more worried, how are we going to get over the Chatham Bar? Can we keep it down in that row, please? Thank you. So he's going to go to the stern section. He's going to leave the fishing pier. Here it is today, but it was pretty much the same back then. He is warned by a couple of fishermen, don't do it. They even suggest, pretend you're doing it and pretend you get lost and come back. You know, this is nuts, going out at night over the Chatham Bar. But when you read the book, you'll see he was in a rescue that was not successful. So I think that really weighed heavily on him. Like, I can't mess up again. He didn't mess up the first time, but he wants to save lives. So out they go, and it's calm water at first because you're protected by that barrier island. This is one of the parts of the movie that always stayed with me. It's kind of like the movie Jaws, where when you don't see the shark, it's scarier. You know, I tried to do that in the Claws book. You don't get a good look at this lobster until later on. But in the movie, they show them going out, and it's quiet. But in the background, you just hear boom, boom, and it's the waves breaking on the Chatham Bar. And Richard looks at Bernie, and that's when their eyes go wide. It really hits them. What are we doing? We're going to be killed. But, you know, this is their duty, and they've been ordered out. So this is the boat they were in. It's 36 feet. It's made out of wood. Waves are bigger than the boat. Bernie was standing behind the windshield there. While their crew members would be in different spots, but they're all just hanging on, getting ready to approach the bar. And there's paintings of them leaving, but, you know, because it's night, you don't have a photo of them at the Chatham Bar. And then here's their path. So I asked some Coast Guard contacts, well, what would it have looked like if a picture was taken? He sent me this great photo. He said, this is what it would look like. And this boat's bigger than Bernie's. This is a Coast Guard 47-footer. And you've got the breaking seas because it's hitting a bar, sandbar. And look what happens. It just engulfs the boat. There were 7 men and women on this Coast Guard vessel. You see the tip of the bow, the top of the screen. And then it totally rolls it over. And the only reason they survived, there were injuries, but the only reason they survived is they had the surf belt on around the waist that they clipped to strong points on the vessel, and the vessel is self-righting, so when it comes back up, they'd still be with the boat rather than crushed on the rocks. So I said to Bernie, did you have your surf belt on? And he just laughed. He said, Mike, they weren't even invented. He said, I had taken off my regular belt and tied it somehow around the steering wheel so I wouldn't get swept over. And I said, you know, going back to these pictures, did you capsize? He said, no, go back to the first one like this. He said, when we hit the bar, the wave broke on the bow so hard it busted out the section of the window that was directly in front of him. And he said all the water came through the vessel and took the compass right off the mount. And so now he's got no compass. And he tries again, and the next time it actually kills the engine. Usually that's the kiss of death. You're going to go broadside to the waves and you're going to roll. But Andy, who was the engineer on board, he went down below and started the engine back up. I don't know how, he kind of reprimed it. And Bernie said, then once we got the engine, he said the third big one was coming. He said, I gave it full power, And he said, we kind of went through the top part of the wave. So in the movie, they exaggerate that a bit, but it is based on fact. They were underwater for a while. And when they came out the other side, Bernie thought his crew would be gone, but they all managed to hang on. And then his next thought is, we've lost the compass. How are we going to find, the boat, the ship? Had I been on that boat and lost the compass, that would have been my excuse to turn back. And I could tell the commanding officer, okay, we tried, but we're not going to find the tanker. It's terrible, but they kept going. So they do find the oil tanker, and in the book, Bernie says, I think I was guided by a higher power. So there's so many weird things that happened that night, and of course I'm taking notes, so I put all those strange things in. And they are strange, they don't quite add up. But he said, we could see the ship, and I want to just read to you a section from the book about them arriving. If I can find it. I'm going to jump ahead just a second. So they start coming down the ladder. They put down the Jacob's ladder. Some land on the bow, some land in the water. Richard Livesey and Andy are pulling them in as fast as they could. They got about 15 on board. That's a lot on this little boat. And they figure it's riding low in the water. We're going to sink. Should we head back in? But they see like 5 more up there, and they're like, we can't leave them. But it turned out it wasn't 5 more up there, it was 18 more. They've got 15 on board, and there's 18 up there. And down they come, and the boat's riding lower. You can't just stay in one place because they're going to get slammed into the vessel. And they come to the 32nd man, and he was the ship's cook, big guy, 6'2", heavy. His nickname was Tiny. His nickname was Tiny Myers, was his last name. I'll read that section. 31 survivors were now on board a vessel that was designed to carry only 12 men, including the crew. 2 men were still on deck. Raymond Seibert, who was the de facto captain, he's played by Casey Affleck in the movie, and Tiny Myers. Fitzgerald kept the searchlight on the beefy man as he made his way slowly down the Jacob's ladder. Myers was shirtless now, having given much of his own clothing to warm up other members of the Pendleton crew. The swell surrounding the ship had become even more violent at this point, making it a greater challenge for Bernie to steer the lifeboat. Just a few more, and we can get the hell out of here, he thought. Myers was halfway down the ladder when he suddenly slipped and fell into the deep ocean. He resurfaced seconds later, and the lifeboat crew tried frantically to pull him on board. "Come this way," Andy yelled. Myers drifted over to the inboard side of the lifeboat, grabbed a hold of a line. Richard Livesey then leaned far over the side of the vessel and reached for Myers' hand. The move nearly cost Livesey his life. Myers was so heavy and strong that he began to pull Livesey down into the water. Maskey and Fitzgerald rushed over to help, grabbing hold of Livesey by the legs and waist to prevent him from being pulled overboard. As they tried in vain to hoist Myers onto the boat, the large man was swallowed by an even larger wave and disappeared from sight. And basically what happened is they lost their grip on him, then the wave hit the lifeboat, sent it up against the oil tanker, and it crushed tiny mires in between. So, you know, Andy used to tell me, Mike, they call this the greatest Coast Guard rescue. He said, but when I think of it, I can still see tiny Meyer's face in the water because we had it. You know, I remember Richard Livesey saying, yeah, he almost pulled me off into the water, and those guys were holding me by the belt, so I didn't get pulled in. So they did lose one man, but then they got the last guy off the engineer. So they've got 32 survivors plus a 4-man crew. It's 36 men on a 36-foot boat. It's just like beyond comprehension. People have tried to get like 36 students without life vests on and smaller people. They can't fit them on. So how they did it, Andy said, oh, there's a way. I said, how? He said, when your life is at stake, you find a way. He said they were on top of each other down in the compartment, around our legs, hanging on to anything they could hold as we headed back in. And here they are arriving at the dock, and the people at the dock who know they were out are thinking, oh, what a shame. They've been gone for 3 hours and they only rescued 2 men. But the survivors are down, you know, in the compartment, locked in there. And like a clown in a car, you know, a car in a clown parade, the hatch opens and they all come up, and people on the dock are just amazed. And so this picture was taken by a professional photographer and then leaving that survivor's compartment. So they're all coming out. And the next picture I know at my heart, this is my favorite of the group. It's a little later, and everybody's left except Bernie and Irvin Maskey, two rescuers. And you could see Bernie up high. He's got his head in his hands. And Irvin Mask down below. And with Bernie, you could just see like the relief. And I said, what were you thinking? And he said, I couldn't believe it was over. He said, I couldn't believe I was alive and that this whole thing was over. And he said, then we were taken back to the Coast Guard station where all the survivors were taken as well. And they were, so the 4 rescuers, so there's Richard Livesey, 1, 2, 3 in from the left, 1 from Fairhaven. So this picture went out across the country, America's Heroes. And I like to joke that even a hero can make a mistake. Bernie's on the left, he forgot to zip his fly. And, Bernie had a great sense of humor. So, Bernie, if you're looking down at us, Bernie was an interesting guy. He didn't want to do the book. It took a lot of work on my part to convince him. I can explain why later. But the survivors were there too, and the media was there, so they're taking pictures. You see the old camera in the back. One of them was collapsed on the floor, maybe the sudden heat after being so cold. And a live radio interview was going on, so this is big news. And when I did, look at those old newspapers from around the country, this was on the front page. And it was the headlines of the Boston Globe for 2 straight days. And then another photo of the 4 rescuers, and Richard said it was fine being called a hero, and then everything died down. But Bernie said, like, it became a burden. He said, I made the Coast Guard a career, many, many years in it. And he said, like, for example, after the rescue, the Coast Guard would have me go speak to big audiences, and he said, I'm only 24 years old. I'm very uncomfortable being introduced as America's hero. But the Coast Guard knew I was a great recruiting tool, so they were having me go all over the country. Here's one picture where Bernie had to speak. And he said that gets old really quick. And even some jealousy within the Coast Guard. He said, rightfully so, probably other men had done rescues as difficult and didn't get the publicity. And that was one reason he didn't want to do the book. So there's that section of the ship he did the rescue on. You can still see the Jacob's ladder. It did hit a shoal and flop over. Here it is weeks later. And it stayed there until the blizzard of '78 tore it apart, so people could climb on board and take off souvenirs. And then remember the bow section where I said only one man jumped and we don't know what happened to the captain? I did find a coastie. His name was Mel Guthrie, and I looked for him all over the country. He turned out to live a mile from my house. So he said, come over. I took pictures. He said, I was ordered to go out when the seas were calm and get the bodies off the penitent bow because it never totally sank. And I said, that must have been awful. He said, yeah, I was not looking forward to it. He said, I entered through the bridge, and you can see the metal here, it's all torn up. And he said, I had a flashlight. No one was in there. He said, what'd you do? He said, now I had to take the flashlight, go through all these hallways beneath the ship. And he went all the way to the bow. And he said, right at the tip, he said, there's a bunch of paint cans stored and some burlap bags. And when he looked under one of the burlap bags, was one of the seamen frozen solid. So I said, where did you find the captain? He said, I didn't. He said, I searched every inch of the ship. So we'll never know what happened to the captain and 3 others. Did they get swept off at it? Did they launch their own little rescue lifeboat? Their bodies were never found. And the good news is the lifeboat that Bernie used has been fixed up and it floats at Rock Harbor in Orleans. So it won't be there too much longer, probably through the first part of October. Then they move it to a more protected place. But if there's volunteers there, you can go on board and you'll wonder how did they get 36 people on. And there's the propeller from the original lifeboat. They put a new propeller on. My website has some interviews with these men. Don't jump ahead. I'll close with a little story about Bernie. A couple stories. One, he wasn't alive to see the movie made, he didn't even know about it. And he used to kind of needle me and joke with me. He goes, you authors dream of movies. And I go, yes. And he goes, if they ever make a movie, I go, uh-huh. He goes, I want Don Knotts to play me. So he was very humble. And, one thing he did, the Coast Guard wanted to give him the gold life-saving medal and his crew the silver. The gold's the highest you can get. And I said, what was that all about? He said, oh, it was a call from the commandant. And he said, I was about to hang up the phone, but it didn't seem right. So I said, no, the crew has to get the gold too. And they said, too late for that. Be in Boston on such and such a day for a big ceremony. And Bernie goes, if you don't give my crew, including Richard Lipsey, the gold, I'm not going to accept it, and I won't go to Boston. So he called their bluff, and all 4 got the gold. So, it shows he wasn't this person looking for attention at all. It was just a class act. And why don't I just take 3 questions, and I'll take more as I do the book signings. And if there are no questions, yeah, did you have one?
Michael, have you ever heard when you were talking about helicopter rescues?
Yeah.
They have to let that line
The cable,
go,
yeah.
and it needs to touch the water first, because if the person touches it, there's so much.
Yes, you can get the shock. People have told me about that shock. What he was describing when they lowered the rescue swimmer, he's on this very thin cable, the size of my pinky. And I always thought, okay, then they swim and the cable's attached to the harness. They unhooked from the cable, and now they're alone in the storm and doing the rescue. So that's how it works. And then they get the survivor, and they motion for the helicopter to lower the basket. So the rescue swimmer is all alone in the water. And we do have female rescue swimmers now as well. It's a grueling program to go through. Most, 80% wash out. There are others? Yes?
Who owned the tankers?
What's that?
Who owned the tankers?
Who owned what?
The tankers,
I couldn't hear.
oil tankers.
Who owned the tankers? Oh, the Kaiser Company both owned them, and they were what's called T2 oil tankers. And my theory is that they split in half. Here's the hull resting on the ocean, but the waves are so big. Say you have a wave underneath the stern or one under the bow, then you'd have the trough in the middle. I think with nothing to support the middle, the weight cracked. And that both of them cracked right down the middle sideways. And I'll just close with the story about Bernie trying to get him to do the book. I call him up, he doesn't know me. And I say, I've been researching this story, and I really know it, and now I'm ready to interview you. And he goes, I don't want to do it. And I'm like, I can't do the book without him. He was there. So he goes, thank you. He was very polite, kind of gruff. And he goes, I just don't want to do it. So I sent him my first book about a rescue called 10 Hours Under Dawn. And I waited a month, and I called him. I said, did you get the book? He goes, yes. I said, did you like it? He goes, yes. I go, will you work with me? He goes, no. So I sent him Fatal Forecast, another one of these books, and we went through the same thing, and this time he goes, okay, I'll do it on a trial basis. And later, when I got to know his daughter, we were at the premiere of the movie. She goes, oh, I know all about that. Could you call me each time and say, there's this author calling me to do it, and I'm kind of checking him out and seeing just how committed he is. So a good thing I didn't give up on the first phone call and sent him the books. One last question.
One last question. Throughout the beginning of the picture slides,
Yep.
there were some very amazing pictures. And we're just wondering, who took those pictures?
Some were from circling aircraft, some were from Coast Guard men on the cutters that were involved, then turned over to the Coast Guard. And then some of the ones like Bernie coming back to the dock, that was by a professional photographer, Dick Kelsey, who just happened to live in Chatham. And his pictures were crisp and clear. So I was so lucky to be able to, as I'm writing the book, and then when I brought in a co-author, to be able to look at the pictures and kind of visualize what might have been happening that day. But I'll take more questions as I sign the book. So the adult sea rescue books are on that back table. The young adult and the 50% off books are on the side table. And thank you to the Friends of the Library for organizing this and getting such a great turnout. Thank you very much.